You have a setting and a stage where you have heroes and villains at play in a political world, and everything seems to make sense to you. And that tidiness, that right there, I think is the marker of confirmation bias.
Today, we're going to talk about one of the most pervasive biases that we have within our cognitive operating system, and that is confirmation bias, the phenomenon of I knew it all along, or that one is constantly seeking confirmatory evidence for their positions in life, their opinions in life. And we talk a lot about political discussion on this series, of course, and this is one of the major problems once people start to move toward always want to confirm what they already think. They immerse themselves very deeply in a particular worldview. The more slanted that worldview is, the more work is involved to confirm it. But often people will do that work and end up being in very polarized positions or being at odds with other people's reality if you've gone down these sort of rabbit holes, these cognitive rabbit holes of our own making too much.
Yeah, this turned out to be the starting point for our work as scientists in this space. And I think a lot of what happens when it comes to political behavior or how we consume information is explicable in terms of our mind's affinity for information that confirms the stories that we want to tell ourselves. And it's kind of like this, like the movie you see of the world in front of you isn't just this objective documentary of events unfolding in front of us. A lot is on the cutting room floor from the movie that we've edited down, taking out anything that doesn't seem to jive or gel with what we want to be true about the world. We will willfully try to blind ourselves, to remove ourselves from situations where we can confront information that's inconvenient, doesn't seem to tell the story. The confirmation bias is this tendency we have to downplay or to suppress or to ignore altogether information that cuts against the beliefs that we hold.
That's right. And we talk about open-mindedness. We strive to be open-minded as individuals. And then the alternative is the closed mind position, a closed mind being, I've already made my mind up. I don't want to listen to what you have to say. Confirmation bias is a little bit more nuanced than that. It's along those same lines, but what you observe with confirmation bias is more like selective permeability. You're letting certain things in and blocking certain other things. Much like a cell membrane, if you remember back to biology, cell membranes are impenetrable except to certain molecules. And it's quite a bit like what happens in a polarized political landscape. People already kind of have a worldview, and they will receive information that fits with that, aligns with it, bolsters it, strengthens it, and they'll selectively block out anything that is an alternative. And so that is really the path to radicalization, which makes this such a diabolical topic. And it is something that we have to actively guard against in our minds because it's a basic property of a human mind, or maybe minds in general. Let's talk a little more about the science behind confirmation bias that applies to all of us.
Yeah, I think one way we can think about this is fighting against confirmation bias is kind of like it's like a top spin on that story we were told as kids to eat your vegetables, right? It's nutritious to try to seek out company, seek out settings where we're going to be confronted with information that can tamp down that feeling of certainty and heightened confidence that we have about the way we understand the world around us. I think being lost at sea is oftentimes the alternative to having a world that's been constructed and curated with our confirmation bias. I mean, if we think about it this way, if you're sort of sculpting your view of the world in a way that's perfectly coherent, you have to leave a lot of details out. You have to be able to have this perfectly coherent picture so that everything reinforces one another, that you have a setting and a stage where you have heroes and villains at play in a political world, and everything seems to make sense to you. And that tidiness, that right there, I think, is the marker of confirmation bias. Because if you look at events as they really play out, there's a lot of chaos. There's so much reality for us to take in, and our brains have to cope with that somehow. So a lot of what the brain actually does is inhibitory. A lot of what the brain does is filtering information. It's seeking out those elements, as you said with that analogy of the semi-permeable membrane, so that it helps to keep that coherent, crystalline structure of the world as intact as possible. And it gives us a sense of being very much at sea, kind of lost, not being able to find our bearings. What is true north, right? That sense of not really knowing what is up and what is down, that kind of reality is very difficult to work with as far as guiding our actions, being able to have any sort of direction and pursuit in our lives, socially speaking, and even as individuals.
It really all comes back to making sense of the world, which is something our brains are constantly battling to achieve. And I feel like you witness confirmation bias a lot in kids and in adolescents, where they're trying to build a worldview that makes sense internally. And they're taking in information with a goal toward fitting the pieces together, kind of assembling this model within their own minds. And as they start to move toward clarity on a model, I think the temptation is to just basically gain confidence in that model so that you're not scrapping it and starting all from scratch. You know, it'd be a very maddening state of affairs to constantly be revising your worldview on a daily basis. Like, wow, I would thought that yesterday, but I have to completely change. Start from scratch, begin reassembling. And so within our minds, we are creating a simulation of the world. And perhaps one of the reasons we've become more polarized over time, or it seems that we may have, is that more information is available than ever before in human history on a daily basis. And it is a matter of blocking some level of that information. We simply could not take in the available information ever at this point. And that wouldn't have been true, say, 100 years ago, or certainly 500 years ago. Your daily information intake would have just come from interacting with other people, and a limited number of them. There was not this barrage of constant information that we now face. So we're faced with having to block or inhibit some level of the information while promoting some coherent worldview within our minds. And I would like to bring up a term that I quite liked. I was in a clinical psychology gathering at one point, and these were active therapists who do work with clients, and they said people find themselves in a psychic equivalent state. And what that means, it's a great term for describing, they think what's going on in their mind is reality. What they, their psychic reality is physically instantiated in the world around them. And that's a problem. If you're attempting to engage in some sort of talk therapy, you want to be able to see the world for its richness and its complexity, and not be focused on your purely egocentric perspective. So I think that's one of the important lessons toward grappling with reality in a way that's closer to the way it really is sort of acknowledging my mind has limits, my mental models have limits. I can take in guidance from other people, and as a joint project, we can both improve our mental model.
If anything, I think the world of politics, or just the way our minds operate in a political setting, is a cautionary tale of what happens when the mind is left to its own devices and is in this very perilous state of having to cope with so much information and just a dizzying array of information, avalanche coming in every day from every which direction, and needing to be able to cope with it somehow. We use these rules of thumb as a way to be able to come up with this coherent picture and keep it protected. But I think part of the answer here, and this is some of our ongoing work as researchers, is understanding the metacognitive elements to all this. Metacognition refers to what seems to be one of the hallmarks of the human capacity for thinking about our own thinking patterns. It's recursion. We can think about how our own minds work. And that's really kind of it's an incredible thing when you come to appreciate the kind of leverage that affords to us, in the sense that I can predict what I'm going to do in a setting before I'm even there. I already know how I'm going to react to certain information before I see it. For instance, if I know something about my own positions on different policy issues, if I'm about to see a series of studies that confirm or seem to confirm the belief I hold, I can predict how I'm going to react to that. If I'm confronted with studies that create some tension in my mind, I can foresee that as well. But that gives me some empowerment to know something about my own minds. How trustworthy am I of a judge of information when it's placed in front of me? Because what are called priors. Basically, whatever beliefs I'm bringing into the situation before I even look at information. And I think that that's one of the values of engaging in conversation about politics is we get to learn something about the tripwires of our own minds. We get to learn how to be better disciplinarians of our own minds' tendencies, knowing what we're going to do beforehand and finding ways to mitigate that ahead of time. By, for instance, seeking out the company of those who we know don't really see things the way we do. It's like you're trying to purposely encounter devil's advocates to help you see a larger picture of the world that normally you wouldn't be motivated to see, to find on your own, right?
That's right. And politicians are in the business of feeding confirmation bias to a large degree because they want to get unanimity. They want to secure the vote. And so a very bad way to secure the vote is to present a complicated picture and seem to not have all the answers and kind of say a lot of I don't knows and it's complicated and I'll have to talk to others. That doesn't inspire people from kind of the on the debate stage leadership aspect. And also with regard to getting votes, the party that can present a very coherent picture, a vivid picture, a picture you're not going to question is going to be more successful. So there's a lot of motivation from both politicians and from particularly slanted media sources to present a very neat and tidy version of reality and bolster that and add confidence to it. So not to say that that's the wrong thing to do. That's just part of the landscape we live in with the two-party system and the way a democracy functions. It serves the party interest to present something that makes people fall into that confirmation bias pattern. And again, it's not a bad thing, right? The confirmation bias in its worst form is where you fail to check erroneous assumptions and allow those to become reality within your mind inappropriately because you're selectively blocking some of the most important information. However, confirmation bias in a good way is where we move toward an acceptable solution, we gain confidence in it, we find it to be workable, and we get the job done, right? And we don't have to understand everything about a task or a computer program or a security system to be able to interact with it. That would be self-defeating. We need to know enough about it to get the job done. And so that's often the challenge is our brains just hit a threshold where we say, that's enough, we can carry this out. And so that's where confirmation bias also lives, is when we've sort of done enough that we're reasonably confident, and then we feel as if we should abandon the project of checking our assumptions further. We should actually always be checking our assumptions further because we have incomplete pictures of the world. So I think that's part of why this is so challenging to deal with.
I think it's really important to point out, right, is that it's not just some sort of hindrance to us being able to move and operating rationally and adaptively in the world. There's a reason we have a confirmation bias. It does serve a role in helping us to have coherent behavior, sense-making capacities, right? But here's the issue, I think, is that we need to recognize some of the perils as well. And one of these perils, I think we can all attest to this, is that it does lend itself to a very Manichaean good versus evil way of seeing the world, because it does help us to create narratives and stories. Where the real problem comes in is when we attempt to dialogue with others, especially those who hold different views to us. If we have a confirmation bias that tells us that the reason why we think the way we do is not because of different value settings, maybe I'm more so in the direction of revaluing tradition and security rather than more so about stimulation seeking or more hedonic qualities, right? If I don't tell myself that's the reason I hold my views, but if it's instead because I have this grandiose sense of my own cognitive abilities. We hear this all the time. Well, I'm a libertarian, a liberal, progressive, a conservative, because I'm reasonable, because I believe in reason. Where we think we have a monopoly on reason and others don't, that's where we get into trouble. Because then you think, well, why would I dialogue with someone who has no purchase on reason? That's the real issue. But they're just like us. and we're just like them. We're built as lawyers primarily, not necessarily as scientists. Karl Popper, the great philosopher of science, observed that pseudoscience is the tendency to look for self-fulfilling theories. Theories that seem to explain everything. Theories that explain everything explain nothing, because there's no conditions under which they can be falsified. That's what he said the marker of science is purposely looking for events, situations that seem to disconfirm a theory that we hold. But as human beings, we don't do this naturally. It's why we came up with the method of science. It's a prosthetic that we use for our minds to supplement and mitigate some of our natural tendencies. A scientist isn't a scientist because of the way their brain works, it's because of the methods they subscribe to. And when we're in conversation with others, if we know up front that they are equipped with the same things that their car engine is equipped the same way ours is, we have a basic level of respect for one another, knowing that we're both doing our best, our good faith best to make sense of the world, and we're both going to have blind spots. But we can cover each other's blind spots because of our different motivations, because of the different values that we subscribe to. There's a message of hope in there, and the sense that we can have respect for each other despite our differences.
That's a great point. And regarding science, the scientific method, when done properly, you would want to falsify potential hypotheses, explanations about the world. What you're seeking is that critical evidence that would make something not the case. And if we do that repeatedly, it's like you're a tree of understanding in which you're kind of scaling this trunk, and then there are these different branches that you encounter that lead to dead ends, and one way is the way up the tree. And what you want to do, imagine you're doing this blindly, is kind of take away all the branches that don't lead you up. And that's what science is about, testing out those branches and validating, do they actually get us further, or do they turn out to be a dead end? And so it's punishing to do this, and it's laborious to do this. People often complain about the slowness at which the scientific process occurs. It is much slower than, say, just marketing a product that you like and want to convince people of. And the reason science goes slowly is because it has that laborious quality of constantly rigorously checking one's assumptions with the idea that ultimately the simplest explanation is best, Occam's razor, and one where you have checked the alternatives and found them to basically not move you forward enough. So the scientific process is very different than being a lawyer, which you mentioned, which is, of course, to present the most coherent case possible. And in many cases, both sides of a law dispute are going to present very compelling narratives. However, those narratives are going to be at odds. That's much more like what we see on the political stage, where one party has to win the day. So they're not in the business of carefully presenting the most accurate version of reality. And furthermore, there are 330 some million of us in the United States, and we don't all want the same things, and we don't all have the same lifestyles. So there's the best answer for me in the year 2023 is maybe different than Michael in 2023, and probably different than the Dans and Michaels of 2030, where we'll have different concerns. So you sort of scale that up to the size of the nation we are now with the amount of information available, and it becomes a very big problem at that scale.
And ironically, almost all politicians, as their background, their professional backgrounds, they're lawyers. And if we are sort of like natural-born lawyers as human beings. Dan Sperber and Mercier, both cognitive scientists, they were the architects of this theory, this argumentative theory of reasoning. And it's not to say that there's universal consensus and agreement that they have a complete correct picture of why human beings engage in reasoning, but their thinking is that one of the major reasons why human beings are capable of engaging in a reasoning process, that discursive ability to try to take in evidence, take in information, form predictions about the world, is to engage in argument, to engage in persuasive behavior in social settings. And politicians, what they excel at is inspiring action. That's one thing for us to keep in mind, is that their goal isn't that of a scientist, where they're trying to come up with this coherent, correct picture, a model of the world as accurate as possible. Because if it was, it would probably be so overly complicated, it would be difficult to even discern what action to take at all. It's that sense of paralysis by analysis. But ideologies, they have a different purpose. An ideology is a coherent picture of the world that filters out enough of the details so that it seems like coherent action is available. So it's a filtering mechanism, but the problem is if we forget this, if we think the ideology we subscribe to, whether it's conservatism or liberalism or progressivism, whatever it is, if we think, no, this is a true model of the world, this is like a scientific picture of the world, that's where hubris gets the best of us. We forget its role. It's there to inspire action, to go vote, to go donate to campaigns, because one is equipped with certainty. But on the other hand, when we're engaged in dialogue, this is an exercise in disassembling these perfect, low-resolution pictures of the world, these ideologies that we construct. And instead, we're purposely engaging in a more fluid process of interrogating our priors, interrogating our beliefs at the ground level, and that's where growth can happen for both individuals engaged in an exercise like that.
We're probably sounding like a broken record that growth is the goal and exploration is the goal as well. So in our early lives where we've just lived in maybe a smaller hometown, we have a pretty confident sense about the world. And then we go take a trip to a city or go overseas and wow, it turns out there's all this terrain and all these people and all these ideas and different styles of dress and language and architecture, all that human richness. And we said, wow, we really had a very narrow picture of the world. The same kind of thing can happen in the information landscape. If you have been taking in information from, say, the same news source repeatedly, and that's the only news source you go to, you're living very locally on the information landscape, and you're failing to probably realize that there's a very large diversity of opinions, enormous amounts of extra information that you're simply not making use of. So exploring is the answer. Every day, try to find a different source. Try to find multiple sources for any one idea. Embrace the complexity that is characteristic of reality. Reality is complex. The world's complex. Our minds are complex. So hiding out in sort of a localized information pocket is very dangerous because we can become very radicalized and our ideas about the world then become very much at odds. We'll experience a lot of friction out in other areas of the world talking to other people if we've stayed too local within that information landscape. So exploring is an answer, and this is where dialogue comes in. You really need to talk to other people with an open mind, or at least a very permeable mind. It can be selectively permeable, but let more in than you're bouncing out. And it's only through talking to other people and kind of sharing ideas, embracing the shared project, that you begin to actually appreciate the greater complexity of a position on, whether it be gun control, abortion, states' rights, immigration. Pick your favorite or least favorite topic, whatever gets you emotionally engaged, and just try to seek more information. Force yourself to confront more information because you'll be stronger. Your internal reality will become stronger from doing so.
I think this episode is a nice foundation in explaining one of the most pervasive tendencies of our mind, this confirmation bias. And so we appreciate everyone's attention and going on this exploration with us. And if you're enjoying these conversations, be sure to click subscribe.
That's right. And feel free to comment because we want to be pointed out when we're wrong. Because that's how you embrace and grow and explore that information space. This was a good conversation. I look forward to the follow-ups.
Absolutely.